During the war crimes trials, in 1946, some of the dried bones from mass graves were unearthed for inspection by Chinese officials' Alliance for Preserving the Truth of the Sino-Japanese War. What the world knew, 147 lines, like Panay victims under Japanese fire, for full flour, and butchery and looting reign in Nanking. When Ali's and Mail's footage hit the theaters, it only aroused more outrage and anti-Japanese sentiment among American audiences. Japanese damage control. The moment the foreign correspondents left Nanking, the Japanese sealed off the city to prevent other reporters from coming in. George Fitch witnessed the beginning of this on December 15, the day he drove some of the foreign correspondents out of the city to the riverfront so that they could board a gunboat for Shanghai. When Fitch tried to drive back into Nanking from Xiaquan, a Japanese sentry stopped him at the gate and absolutely refused to let him re-enter. Even Mr. Okamura, a member of the Japanese embassy from Shanghai, who accompanied Fitch, was unable to persuade the man to let them through. The embassy cuts no ice with the army in Japan. In the end, Okamura had to take one of the cars to military headquarters to get a special pass for Fitch. When the Japanese finally permitted a few foreigners to enter the city, they carefully controlled their movements. In February, they allowed a few American naval officers to go ashore in Nanking, but only when accompanied by Japanese embassy representatives in a Japanese embassy car. As late as April, the Japanese High Command prevented most foreigners from freely leaving or entering the city. To cover up the nauseating details of their military outrages, the Japanese even impeded the return of foreign diplomats to Nanking. But in the end, they proved unsuccessful in hiding the truth, especially from the Germans and the Americans. Foreign intelligence on the rape of Nanking. Hitler's government soon learned the Japanese motives for the delay. The assumption I made in my previous report that the Japanese delayed our return in order to have no official witnesses of the atrocities has been confirmed, a German diplomat reported to Berlin in January. Once the intention of the foreign representatives to return to Nanking had been made known, according to Germans and Americans who were there were feverish cleanup efforts undertaken to remove the evidence of the senseless mass murders of civilians, women and children. The American government also knew what the Japanese were trying to hide. A machine cipher had protected the Japan's foreign office's high-level diplomatic messages, but by 1936 cryptanalysts from the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service had cracked the Japanese code, which the Americans dubbed Red. American intelligence was thus able to intercept and read secret messages between the Japanese leadership in Tokyo and their representatives in Washington, D.C., during the Rape of Nanking. On December 26, 1937, Foreign Minister Hirota Kaki sent one such message to Japanese Ambassador Sato Hiroshi in Washington. It emphasized the need to stonewall the American embassy staff to prevent their immediate return to Nanking. If they do return and receive unfavorable reports on the military's activities from their own nationals, and if the diplomats, on receipt of such complaints, forward the reports to their home countries, we shall find ourselves in an exceedingly disadvantageous position, the message read. We believe, therefore, that the best policy is to do our utmost to hold them here as long as possible. Even if this should cause some hard feeling, we believe that it would be better than running the risk of a clash on the scene. But the U.S. government did not disclose to the public what it knew at the time, and even contributed to Japanese censorship of the truth. For example, Norman Ali, the Universal newsreel man, had shot 5,300 rolls of movie film of the Japanese attack on the Panay, but before the film was released to the theaters, President Roosevelt asked him to excise some 30 feet of film that revealed several Japanese bombers shooting at the gunboat at nearly deck level. Ali agreed, even though those 30 feet were probably the best what the world knew, 149 images in the entire film, and certainly the most damning to the Japanese government. Flamilton Darby Perry, author of The Panay Incident, believes that Roosevelt wanted to give credence to the Japanese excuse that the attack was a case of mistaken identity, not deliberate design. No doubt the U.S. government was anxious to reach a financial and diplomatic settlement with the Japanese over the bombing, and knew that those 30 feet of film would have made such a settlement impossible. Japanese propaganda. Japanese attempts to influence public opinion were nothing new. Even before the Rape of Nanking, the American intelligence community had seen the Japanese plans, marked at most secrecy, to spread favorable propaganda of themselves in the United States. The Japanese government also had a large budget for wooing influential newspapermen, advertising in major newspapers and radio stations, and printing pamphlets and leaflets. But during the Rape of Nanking, the Japanese faced a public relations disaster so titanic it seems almost ridiculous today that they even tried to cover it up. Instead of bringing a measure of discipline to their forces in Nanking, the Japanese marshaled together their resources to launch a blitz of propaganda, which they hoped would somehow obscure the details of one of the greatest bloodbaths of world history. The Japanese media first proclaimed that all was well and good in the city of Nanking. On December 20th, Robert Wilson heard that DOM, the Japanese news agency, had reported that the Nanking population was returning home and everything was normal. If that is all the news coming out of Nanking, it is due for a big shake-up when the real news breaks, Wilson wrote. Then the Japanese government authorized carefully prepared tours of the city for Japanese visitors. A week after the DOM report, a Japanese merchant ship arrived in Nanking from Shanghai, crowded with Japanese sightseers. Carefully 150 The Rape of Nanking. They were herded through the few streets now cleared of corpses. George Fitch wrote of the visit. Graciously they passed sweets to Chinese children and patted their frightened heads. A number of ladies accompanied Japanese business representatives on a tour of the city, and Fitch observed that they seemed tremendously pleased with themselves, also with Japan's wonderful victory, but of course they hear nothing of the real truth, nor does the rest of the world, I suppose. In January, Japanese newsmen came to Nanjing to stage pictures of the city for distribution throughout Japan and the rest of the world. On New Year's Eve, the Japanese embassy called together the Chinese managers of the refugee camps for a meeting and told them that spontaneous celebrations were to be held in the city the next day. The Chinese were ordered to make thousands of Japanese flags and carry them about in a parade for a motion picture that would illustrate crowds of joyful residents welcoming Japanese soldiers. Japanese photographers also came to Nanking to take pictures of Chinese children receiving medical care from a Japanese army doctor and candy from Japanese soldiers. But Lewis Smythe wrote in a letter to his friends, these acts were not repeated when no camera was around. The rankest example of Japanese propaganda was an article that appeared on January 8, 1938 in the Shinshinpao, a Japanese-controlled newspaper in Shanghai. Under the headline "The Harmonious Atmosphere of Nanking City Develops Enjoyably," the article claimed that the Imperial Army entered the city, put their bayonets into their sheaths, and stretched forth merciful hands in order to examine and heal, giving the starving and sick masses in Nanking medical aid and food. Men and women, old and young, bent down to kneel in salutation to the Imperial Army, expressing their respectful intention. The vast hordes gathered around the soldiers beneath the Sun flag and Red Cross flag, shouting Banzai in order to express their gratitude. Soldiers and the Chinese children are happy together, playing joyfully on the slides. Nanking is now the best place for all countries to watch, for here one breathes the atmosphere of peaceful residence and happy work. What the world knew. 151 Japanese attempts to gloss over the entire massacre with hokum provoked incredulous responses in the surviving missionary diaries. Here are a few samples. From the diary of James McCallum, January 9, 1938. Now the Japanese are trying to discredit our efforts in the safety zone. They threaten and intimidate the poor Chinese into repudiating what we have said. Some of the Chinese are even ready to prove that the looting, raping and burning was done by the Chinese and not the Japanese. I feel sometimes that we have been dealing with maniacs and idiots, and I marvel that all of us foreigners have come through this ordeal alive. From the diary of George Fitch, January 11, 1938. We have seen a couple of issues of a Shanghai Japanese newspaper and 2 of the Tokyo Nichi. Those tell us that even as early as December 28 the stores were rapidly opening up and business returning to normal, that the Japanese were cooperating with us in feeding the poor refugees, that the city had been cleared of Chinese looters, and that peace and order now reigned. Well, we'd be tempted to laugh if it wasn't so tragic. It is typical of the lies Japan has been sending abroad ever since the war started. From the diary of George Fitch, reprinted in Reader's Digest in March, a government radio station in Tokyo flashed this message to the world. Hoodlums responsible for so many deaths and such destruction of property in Nanking have been captured and executed. They were found to be discontented soldiers from Chiang Kai-shek's brigades. Now all is quiet, and the Japanese army is feeding 300,000 refugees. From a letter written by Lewis Smythe and his wife on March 8, 1938. Now the latest is from the Japanese paper that they have found 11 Chinese armed robbers who were to blame for it all. Well, if they each raped from 100 to 200 women per night and day for 2 weeks and got away with the reported $50,000, they were pretty powerful Chinese. Leaflets were another form of Japanese propaganda. During the mass executions, Japanese army planes inundated the Nanking population with messages dropped from the air. For example, all good Chinese who return to their homes will be fed and clothed. Japan wants to be a good neighbor to those Chinese not fooled by monsters who are Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers. The leaflets displayed colorful pictures of a handsome Japanese soldier holding a Chinese child, Christ-like, as one observer put it, in his arms, with a Chinese mother at his feet bowing her thanks for bags of rice. According to George Fitch, thousands of Chinese actually left the refugee camps for their ruined homes the day the leaflets were dropped. The Japanese also pasted bright, colorful posters on or near houses in which tragedies had occurred. One featured a Japanese soldier carrying a small child while giving a bucket of rice to his mother and sugar and other food to the father. Igerman Diplomatic Report described the poster as depicting a charming, lovable soldier with cooking implements in hand, who carries on his shoulder a Chinese child, whose poor but honest Chinese farming parents gaze up at him, the soldier, full of thankfulness and family happiness, up to the good uncle. The writing on the upper right corner said, "Return to your homes. We will give you rice to eat. Trust and rely on the Japanese army. You can get help." At the same time, the Japanese hosted glamorous receptions and media events in Nanking and Shanghai to divert attention away from the atrocities. In early February, a Japanese general invited foreign diplomatic representatives to a tea at the Japanese embassy in Nanking. He boasted that the Japanese army was world-renowned for its discipline, and that not a single violation against discipline had occurred during the Russo-Japanese War and Manchurian Campaign. The general said that if for some reason the Japanese had committed outrages in Nanking, it was only because the Chinese people had resisted what the world knew, 153 them, under the instigation of foreign nationals, meaning of course the International Safety Zone Committee. But oddly enough, in the same speech, the general contradicted his previous statements by admitting that Japanese soldiers had vented their anger upon the population because they had found nothing edible or usable during their advance on Nanking. The Japanese media circus, however, failed to fool the foreign diplomatic community about the arson, rape and murder that raged through Nanking. In mid-February, the Japanese held a military concert in Shanghai, complete with geishas and press photographers. A German diplomat observed, however, that while the gala affair was taking place, a mother of an 11-year-old girl, who did not want to release the young girl to rape by the soldiers, was burnt down with her house. The safety zone leaders, Fight Back the International Safety Zone Committee, did all it could to fight the barrage of propaganda. During the first few days of the massacre, the zone leaders enlisted the aid of American foreign correspondents like Frank Tillman Durden, Archibald Steele, and C. Yates McDaniel. But after their departure, the International Committee was left to its own devices. The Japanese government barred other reporters, like Max Koppening of the Chicago Tribune, from entering Nanking, and the behavior of the Japanese soldiers grew worse when they realized that their actions would not be observed by the world media. But the Japanese government underestimated the ability of the International Committee to wage its own publicity campaign. One distinguishing trait that united the zone leaders was their superior training in the verbal arts. Almost without exception, they were eloquent writers and speakers. The missionaries, educated at the best universities in America and Europe, had devoted most of their adult years to delivering sermons, writing papers, and working the Christian lecture circuit. Some of the professors on the committee had written books. Moreover, as a group they were sophisticated about working with the media. Long before the fall of Nanking, they had enjoyed broadcasting speeches over Nanking radio, or penning articles about China for the popular press. Finally, the missionaries had an additional advantage the Japanese did not foresee. They had spent their entire lives contemplating the true meaning of hell. Having found one in Nanking, they wasted no time in describing it for the world public. Their hard, cogent prose recaptured the terror that they witnessed. Complete anarchy has reigned. For 10 days it has been hell on earth. To have to stand by while even the very poor are having their last possession taken from them, their last coin, their last bit of bedding, and it is freezing weather. The poor rickshaw-man his rickshaw, while thousands of disarmed soldiers, who had sought sanctuary with you together with many hundreds of innocent civilians, are taken out before your eyes to be shot or used for bayonet practice, and you have to listen to the sounds of the guns that are killing them, while 1,000 women kneel before you crying hysterically, begging you to save them from the beasts who are preying on them. To stand by and do nothing, while your flag is taken down, and insulted not once, but a dozen times, and your home is being looted, and then to watch the city you have come to love and the institution to which you have planned to devote your best deliberately and systematically burned by fire. This is a hell one had never before envisaged. George Fitch, December 24, 1937. It is a horrible story to try to relate. I know not where to begin nor to end. Never have I heard or read of such brutality. Rape. We estimate that at least 1,000 cases, at night and many by day. In case of resistance or anything that seems like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or bullet. We could write up hundreds of cases a day. People are hysterical. They get down on their knees and kudo anytime we foreigners appear. They beg for aid. Those who are suspected of being soldiers, as well as others, have been led outside the city and shot down by the hundreds, yes, thousands. Even the poor refugees in certain centers have been robbed again and again until the last cent, almost the last garment and last piece of bedding. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon and evening. John McCallum, December 19, 1937. What the world knew. 155. I think I have said enough of these horrible cases. There are hundreds of thousands of them. Being so many of them finally makes the mind dulled so that you almost cease to be shocked anymore. I did not imagine that such cruel people existed in the modern world. It would seem that only a rare insane person, like Jack the Ripper, would act so. John Gillespie Magee, January 28, 1938. The graphic details of Japanese excesses appeared not only in safety zone diaries but in letters and newsletters that were mimeographed or retyped over and over again so that friends, relatives, government officials, and the press could all receive copies. When mailing descriptions of the massacre, the zone leaders often begged the recipients not to disclose authorship of the documents if they were published, for fear that individual committee members would face retribution or expulsion from Nanking. Please be very careful of this letter, as we might all be kicked out if it were published, and that would be a disaster for the Chinese of Nanking, Magee wrote to his family. The Japanese, he explained, would allow the foreigners to leave with the greatest pleasure, but would not allow anyone to return. In the end, the persistence, hard work, and caution of the zone leaders paid off. George Fitch's diary was the first one to be leaked out of Nanking, and it created a sensation in Shanghai. His stories, and others often with key names deleted, swiftly found their way into mainstream print outlets like Time, Reader's Digest, and Far Eastern Magazine, evoking widespread outrage among American readers. Some eventually re-emerged in books, such as in the Manchester Guardian reporter Harold John Timperley's Japanese Terror in China 1938 and Xu Shuxi's Documents of the Nanking Safety Zone 1939. To brace their readers, the zone leaders sometimes prefaced their documents with warnings. What I am about to relate is anything but a pleasant story. In fact, it is so very unpleasant that I cannot recommend anyone without a strong stomach to read it, Fitch wrote in his diary before publication. For it is a story of such crime and horror as to be almost unbelievable, the story of the depredations of a horde of degraded criminals. What the world knew, 157 of incredible bestiality, on a peaceful, kindly law-abiding people. I believe it has no parallel in modern history. True to their predictions, the reports from the International Safety Zone Committee aroused skepticism from the American public. When the article The Sack of Nanking appeared in Reader's Digest, one subscriber wrote, "It is unbelievable that credence could be given a thing which is so obviously rank propaganda and so reminiscent of the stuff fed the public during the late war." Similar comments came from other subscribers. But the editors at Reader's Digest insisted that the stories were true. To defend their credibility, the editors took considerable pains to collect more letters from the safety zone leaders, which they reprinted in the October 1938 issue of the magazine. The material we have seen, the editors has tend to add, would fill an entire issue of this magazine, all of it corroborating the typical extracts which follow. Fortunately, the crimes of Nanking were recorded not only on paper, but on motion picture film, making them almost impossible to deny. John McGee, who possessed an amateur movie camera, filmed several bedridden victims at the University of Nanking Hospital. They were haunting images, the horribly disfigured, charred men the Japanese had tried to burn alive. The enamelware shop clerk, whose head received a tremendous blow from a Japanese bayonet 6 days after entering the hospital, the pulsation of his brain could still clearly be seen. The gang rape victim, whose head was almost cut off by Japanese soldiers. George Fitch eventually smuggled the film out of China, though at great risk to his life. On January 19th, he received a permit to leave Nanking, and took a Japanese military train to Shanghai, where he shared the third-class coach with as unsavory a crowd of soldiers as one could imagine. Sewn into the lining of his camel's hair coat were 8 reels of 16mm negative movie film of Nanking atrocities. There was no doubt in his mind, he told his family later, that if he had been searched and caught with the film, he would have been killed instantly. But luckily Fitch made it to Shanghai, where he took the negatives to the Kodak office, and developed 4 sets of prints. One of them went to the Nazi Party leader John Rabe, before he left Nanking for Germany. Some of the others ended up in the United States, where Fitch and other missionaries showed them during lectures before religious and political groups. Several frames from the films were reprinted in Life magazine. Segments of actual footage later appeared in Frank Capra's newsreel documentary, Why We Fight, Battle of China. Decades later the film reappeared in 2 historical documentaries released during the 1990s, McGee's Testament and In the Name of the Emperor. One can only imagine how the Japanese military leadership smoldered as these written reports, photographs, and even films of Japanese atrocities found their way into the world media. Many of the zone leaders lived in constant terror and believed that the Japanese would kill them all if they could get away with it. Some of the men barricaded themselves in their houses, and after dark dared not venture outdoors except in 2s or 3s. At least one, George Fitch, suspected that there was a price on his head. But despite their fear, they continued to take turns guarding key areas of the zone at night and persisted in publicizing the Japanese atrocities. The Japanese military hate us worse than the enemy, for we have shown them up to the world, John McGee wrote on January 28, 1938. We are all surprised that none of us have been killed, and whether we all get out safely is yet a question. Th6 occupation of Nanjing. The Rape of Nanking continued for months, although the worst of it was concentrated in the first 6 to 8 weeks. By the spring of 1938, the people of Nanking knew that the massacre was over, and that while they would be occupied they would not necessarily all be killed. As Nanking lay prostrate under Japanese rule, the military began to implement measures to subjugate the entire population. At first there was not much to subjugate. You cannot imagine the disorganization of the city. One foreigner wrote, the dumping of filth and every kind of waste everywhere, trash and human flesh putrefied in the streets, because the Japanese did not permit anything to be done without their permission, not even the disposal of garbage and corpses. Indeed, for days army trucks drove over several feet of corpses under the water. gate, grinding over the remains in order to impress upon the populace the terrible results of resisting Le Pen. Observers estimated that Japanese damage to public property totaled some $836 million in 1939 US dollars, and that the private property loss was at least $136 million. These figures do not include the cost of irreplaceable cultural artifacts taken by the Japanese Army. Under the direction of the sociologist Louis Smythe, the International Safety Zone Committee conducted a systematic survey of damage to the Nanking area. Investigators visited every 50th inhabited house in the city, and also went to every 10th family in every 3rd village in the countryside. In a 60-page report released in June 1938, Smythe concluded that the 120 air raids that Nanking experienced and the 4-day siege of the city did only 1% of the damage inflicted by the Japanese army after it entered Nanking. Arson caused most of the destruction. Fires in Nanking began with the fall of the city and lasted more than 6 weeks. Soldiers torched buildings under the guidance of officers, and even used special chemical strips to set the fires. They burned down churches, embassies, department stores, shops, mansions, and huts, even areas within the safety zone. The zone leaders could not put out these fires because their pumps and fire equipment had been stolen by the Japanese. By the end of the first few weeks of the Rape of Nanking, the military had incinerated 1/3 of the entire city and 3/4 of all the stores. They burned down the Russian legation embassy, defiled the American embassy, and ransacked almost every foreign house, even those marked clearly with flags or seals. The Japanese reserved American property for special insult. They tore down the American flag 6 times from the University of Nanking and trampled it in the dirt, threatening to kill anyone who dared to put it up again. But German property suffered almost as badly as American property, despite the alliance between the Nazi and Japanese governments. The Japanese tore down Nazi flags, burned German homes and businesses, and even stole pictures of Hitler and Hindenburg. Remarkable, the occupation of Nanking, 161 Act 1 German wrote, considering the cult of the Japanese for their emperor pictures. The consequences of the sack of Nanking extended far beyond the city walls. Japanese soldiers devastated the countryside around Nanking, torching entire villages by burning down straw huts and collecting furniture, tools, and farming implements into brick houses so that everything could be incinerated all at once. The region near the city was stripped clean of farm animals, both domestic and otherwise. The Japanese also used acetylene torches, pistol shots, and hand grenades to blast open vaults in banks, including the personal safe deposit boxes of German officials and residents. Soldiers were permitted to mail back to Japan some of their booty, but most of the goods were confiscated and concentrated for official use. Warehouses filled rapidly with rare jade and porcelain artwork, rugs and paintings, gold and silver treasures. More than 200 pianos were housed in a single storage hall. In late December, the Japanese began to heap stolen goods, jewelry, art, furniture, metal, antiques on the wharves for transport back to Japan. Japanese looters usually sought big-ticket items. They coveted foreign cars, prompting committee members to believe that the army would have taken all of them in the city if foreigners were not sitting in them. Trucks used to cart corpses away were also stolen. But the Japanese also invaded Nanking University Hospital to steal trivial items, pens, flashlights, and wristwatches from the nurses, and broke into the safety zone repeatedly to steal bedding, cooking utensils, and food from the homeless. A German report noted that on December 15 the Japanese had forced 5,000 refugees to line up so that they could steal a total of $180 from them. Even handfuls of dirty rice were snatched from them by the soldiers, George Fitch wrote. Death was the sure retort to any complaint. In January 1938, not one shop was officially open in Nanking except for a military store and the International Committee's rice shop. The harbor was practically empty of ships. Most of the city lacked electricity, telephone, and water service because the Japanese had rounded up and executed some 50 employees from the local power plant. The lack of running water made it difficult to bathe, but many women chose not to bathe anyway, in hopes that their unwashed flesh would repel Japanese soldiers intent on raping them. Slowly the city came back to life. People could be seen ransacking houses throughout Nanking, ripping out floorboards and wood paneling for firewood, and carting away metal and brick to repair their own homes or to sell on the streets to others. On Shanghai Road in the safety zone, dense crowds of people clustered before hundreds of vendors who sold every kind of loot imaginable, including doors and windows. This activity jump-started the local economy, for next to the roadside merchants of booty, mushroomed new tea houses and restaurants. On January 1, 1938, the Japanese inaugurated a new city government. The Nanking Self-Government Committee, the Nanjing Zizhuayuanhui, or Autonomous Government, as some of the Westerners in the city called it. The Self-Government Committee was staffed with Chinese puppet officials who controlled the city's administration, welfare, finance, police, commerce, and traffic. By spring, Nanking was outwardly starting to function like a normal city again. Running water, electric lighting, and daily mail service resumed. A Japanese city bus service started, rickshaws appeared in the streets, and people could take the train from Nanking to Shanghai. Nanking quickly became a busy shipping center for the Japan as small locomotives, horses, field pieces, trucks, and other supplies were ferried daily from the city to nearby Pukou. But signs of a brutal occupation were everywhere. Chinese merchants endured heavy taxes and rent extortion to finance the salaries of the new officials in power. The Japanese also opened up military shops for the Chinese populace that drained the city of Chinese gold and money and replaced it with worthless military currency. The Chinese puppet government compounded the poverty by confiscating valuables and the occupation of Nanking 163 stocks of inventory that remained in the city, even if the owner was still in town, leading some of the lower Chinese officials to joke cynically among themselves, "We are now doing an authorized plundering." Far more alarming than the exploitation of the populace by taxes and confiscation was the reappearance of opium in the city. Before the Japanese occupation, opium was an underground narcotic, secretly smoked in the back rooms of Nanking by aristocrats and merchants. But it was not sold openly and brazenly in the streets, nor was it conspicuously paraded before young people. After the fall of the city, people could freely stroll into opium dens without interference from the police. These dens boldly advertised the drug with Chinese character shingles marked Kuangta, or official earth, a term used for opium. To encourage addiction and further enslave the people, the Japanese routinely used narcotics as payment for labor and prostitution in Nanking. Heroin cigarettes were offered to children as young as 10. Based on his research, the University of Nanking history professor Minor Cyril Bates concluded that some 50,000 people in the Nanking area were using heroin, 1/8 of the population at the time. Many of the downtrodden citizens of Nanking fell prey to drugs because it gave them the means to escape, if only temporarily, from the misery of their lives. Some even tried to use opium to commit suicide, swallowing large doses as poison. Others turned to crime to support their addiction, causing a wave of banditry to sweep through Nanking. After making conditions ripe for banditry in Nanking, the Japanese used the epidemic of crimes to justify their occupation, preaching the need for imperial law and order. Japanese employers treated many of the local Chinese laborers worse than slaves, often killing them for the slightest infractions. Survivors later claimed that a harsh environment and capricious punishment were deliberately imposed upon the workplace to keep Chinese employees in a constant state of fear. One Chinese man who worked in a factory seized by the Japanese described the horrors that he witnessed there over the occupation of Nanking 165 period of a few months. When a fellow employee was falsely accused by a Japanese overseer of stealing his sweater, he ended up being wrapped with rope, almost mummy-like, from feet to throat, and then stoned to death with a heap of bricks. By the end of the stoning, the body had lost all shape, and the flesh and bones, entwined with the rope, was thrown to the dogs as food. Another time, the Japanese found 4 small shoulder pads missing from the factory and discovered they had been used as toilet paper. A 22-year-old woman who admitted that she had used the toilet that day was dragged behind the factory and beheaded with a knife. That very afternoon, the same Japanese murderer also killed a teenage boy whom he accused of stealing a pair of slippers. The Japanese even inflicted medical experiments on the Nanking people. In April 1939, they opened up a facility in the city to conduct research on human guinea pigs, whom they called zmaku, or lumber. On East Chungshan or Hongsan Street, only a short walk from the Yangtze River, the Japanese converted a 6-story Chinese hospital into a laboratory for research in epidemics, which they named Unit A. 1644. Though the laboratory was situated near a military airport, a geisha district, movie theaters, and conspicuous Japanese centers, such as the Japanese consulate, the military police office, and the headquarters for the Chinese Expeditionary Force High Command, it remained a closely guarded secret. A high brick wall surrounded the compound, topped with barbed wire. The facility was patrolled by guards. The staff was ordered never to mention A1644 in their letters back to Japan. Inside, scientists injected or fed Chinese prisoners with a variety of poisons, germs, and lethal gases. The substances included doses of acetone, arsenate cyanide, nitrite prussiate, and snake poisons such as cobra, habu, and amagasa venom. The Japanese scientists killed about 10 or more people weekly in this manner, and disposed of them in the A1644 incinerator. When the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, the staff of A1644 destroyed their equipment and data, blew up the laboratory, and fled before Chinese troops could reach Nanking. We know about this secret laboratory only because some scientists of the unit confessed their activities to American interrogators after the war. Those Chinese in the city fortunate enough to escape the physical brutality, the Japanese medical experiments, and the lure of drugs lived under a suffocating atmosphere of military intimidation. The Japanese authorities devised a method of mass control by organizing the population into a pyramidal hierarchy. Every 10 households were ordered to appoint a headman, and every 10 of those heads were ordered to appoint another head, and so on. Under this system, every man in Nanking was required to carry a registration card signed by his heads of 10, 100, and 1,000 men, attesting to his loyalty to the new government. Every person was also required to report the presence in his household of any unknown or unregistered person to the immediate head of 10, who reported it to his direct head, and on up until the news reached the district officer of the city government. This was not a Japanese invention, but a traditional Chinese system, called Bojia, revived, no doubt, by the Japanese to legitimize their rule among the natives in Nanking. The Japanese subjected this Bojia system to frequent tests, sometimes releasing men without passes in the city to see if they could find a place to stay. If the men were not caught and reported within 2 hours, the heads of the groups in the neighborhoods where they stayed would be severely punished. This, the committee member Albert Stewart wrote in his diary in 1939, is supposed to be the Japanese way of preserving loyalty to the regime. In spite of war, fire, and massacre, Nanking recovered. The dreaded famine never struck, not only because the Japanese eventually permitted shipments of food to enter the city, but because local farmers were able to harvest winter wheat crops after most of the Japanese troops left Nanking to pursue Chinese forces inland. Within the space of a year, much of the agriculture in the fertile Yangtze Delta area produced yields close to pre-war levels. This is not to say that Nanking did not suffer. The occupation of Nanking 167, food shortages under Japanese occupation. The gardens and arms inside ACLTWAS failed to, because Carrot only confiscated vegetables from them, but forced the farmers, the WUH Timpon 1116, produce for Japanese use. Also as UFRA, AEDN, Japanese authorities in Nanking, Titan COA carrot roti ned necessities such as L and rice. But there is no evidence to suggest that Nanking endured worse hunger or malnutrition than other areas in China. Other cities such as the new nationalist capital of Woking had suffered far worse food shortages during the row. The sale of opium and heroin thrived under Japan's southeast rule. The population of Nanking remained relatively free of disease. After occupation, Japanese authorities in the city, NNINESS-FTE 118, RRT0 Bumkoipsis TH3 perished from illness. I also began an aggressive inoculation program against cholera and typhoid, subjecting the people to shots. Street medical officers wait in the streets and in the tram station to administer inoculations to pedestrians or visitors as they came into the city. This created great resentment among the civilians, many of whom feared the needles would kill them. Children of Western missionaries remember that at the train station, Chinese visitors to Nanking were ordered to step into pans of disinfectant, a requirement that many found deeply humiliating. The Westerner themselves were often sprayed with Lysol upon entering Within a few years, Nanking pulled itself up from its ruins. In the spring of 1938, men started to venture back to the city, some to examine the damage, others to find work because they had run out of money, still others to see whether conditions were safe enough for their families to return. As reconstruction NRFD land for labor grew, soon more men were lured back, and before long their wives and children joined the influx of migration toward Nanking. Within a year and a half, 250 OPOTLOOONHD UBL 60 SURING from an estimated 37 Renan PL 16L in March 1938 to more than 576,000 people in December 1939. Though the population failed to reach the 1 million level that the city had enjoyed back in 1936, by 1942 the population peaked at about 700,000 people and stabilized for the duration of the war. Life under the Japanese was far from pleasant, but a sense of resignation settled over the city, as many came to believe that the conquerors were there to stay. Occasionally there was underground resistance. Once in a while someone would run into a theater packed with Japanese officials and throw a bomb, but in general such rebellion was sporadic and rare. Most of the hostility against the Japanese was expressed non-violently, such as in anti-Japanese posters, flyers, and graffiti. The end of Nanking's ordeal came at last in the summer of 1945. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an untested uranium bomb on Hiroshima, Japan's eighth largest city, killing 100,000 of its 245,000 people on the first day. When a Japanese surrender was not forthcoming, the Americans dropped, on August 9, a second plutonium-type bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Less than a week later, on August 14, the Japanese made the final decision to surrender. The Japanese remained in the former capital of China until the day of the surrender, then quickly left the city. Eyewitnesses reported that Japanese soldiers could be seen drinking heavily or weeping in the streets. Some heard rumors of unarmed Japanese men being forced to kneel by the side of the road to be beaten by local residents. Retaliation against the Japanese garrison appears to have been limited, however, because many residents hid at home during this chaotic time, too fearful to even celebrate in case the news of a Japanese defeat turned out not to be true. The evacuation was swift, and there was no mass persecution or imprisonment of Japanese soldiers. One Nanking citizen recalls that she stayed in her house for weeks after the Japanese surrendered, and when she re-emerged, they were gone. Judgment DXY. Even before World War II drew to a close, the Allies had organized war tribunals to bring Japanese military criminals to justice. Fully expecting a Japanese defeat, the American and Chinese nationalist governments made preliminary arrangements for the trials. In March 1944, the United Nations created the Investigation of War Crimes Committee. A subcommittee for Far East and Pacific war crimes was established in Chongqing, China's wartime capital, after the fall of Nanking. After the Japanese surrender, the planning of the tribunals began in earnest. The Supreme Command of the Allied Powers in Japan worked closely with the Chinese nationalist government to gather information about Japanese atrocities in China. For the crimes committed during the Rape of Nanking, members of the Japanese establishment stood trial not only in Nanking, but in Tokyo itself. The Nanking War Crimes Trial, the Rape of Nanking, had been a deep, festering wound in the city's psyche, a wound that hid years of repressed fear and hatred. When the trials for Class B and C war criminals started in the city, in August 1946, the wound ruptured, spilling forth all the poison that had accumulated during the war. Only a handful of Japanese war criminals were tried in Nanking, but they gave the local Chinese citizens a chance to air their grievances and participate in mass catharsis. During the trials, which lasted until February 1947, more than 1,000 people testified about some 460 cases of murder, rape, arson, and looting. The Chinese government had posted notices in the streets of Nanking, urging witnesses to come forward with evidence, while 12 district offices collected statements from people all over the city. One after another, they appeared in the courtroom, listened to the Chinese judge, warned them about the 5-year sentence for perjury, and then swore an oath of truth by marking printed statements with signatures, seals, fingerprints, or crosses. The witnesses included not only Chinese survivors, but some of the safety zone leaders, such as Minor Sorrels Bates and Lewis Smythe. During the trials, evidence that had been painstakingly hidden for years emerged. One of the most famous exhibits was a tiny album of 16 photographs of atrocities, taken by the Japanese themselves. When the negatives were brought to a film development shop during the massacre, the employees southeastcratly duplicated a set of images, which were placed in an album, hidden in the wall of a bathroom, and later secreted under a statue of Buddha. The album passed from hand to hand. Men risked their lives to hide it even when the Japanese issued threats and conducted searches for photographic evidence of their crimes. One man even fled from Nanking and wandered from city to city for years like a fugitive because of the 16 photographs. The long and complex journey that these pictures made from Photoshop to war crimes trial to their final resting place in archives has inspired numerous articles and even a full-length documentary in China. Judgment Day 171, but not all of the evidence had taken such a sensational, circuitous path to the courtroom. Some came straight from old newspaper clippings. A Japan Advertiser article was brought forth at the trial of 2 lieutenants, Noda Takeshi and Mukai Toshiaki, who had participated in the famous killing contest described in Chapter 2. During the trial, both soldiers, of course, denied killing more than 150 people, each one of them blaming the article on the imagination of the foreign correspondents, and the other insisting that he lied about the contest to better attract a wife when he returned to Japan. When the verdict was read in the courtroom on December 18, 1947, the Chinese audience whooped, cheered, and wept for joy. Both lieutenants were executed by firing squad. The focal point of the Nanking war crimes trials was Tani Hisao. In 1937, he had served as lieutenant general of the 6th Division of the Japanese Army in Nanking, a division that perpetrated many of the atrocities in the city, especially around Chunghua Gate. In August 1, 946, Tani was brought back to China for his trial and hauled in a prison van to a detention camp in Nanking. To prepare for his prosecution, forensic experts in white overalls dug open 5 burial grounds near the Chunghua Gate and exposed thousands of skeletons and skulls, many cracked from gunshot wounds and still stained with dark blood. It must have been frightening for Tani Hisao to face the concentrated fury of an entire city. As he stood in the docks, his yellow Japanese military uniform, stripped of its stars and stripes, more than 80 witnesses came to court to recite an endless litany of horrors. The indictment had been long, listing hundreds of stabbings, burnings, drownings, strangulations, rapes, thefts, and destruction committed by Tani's division. As evidence mounted, all of it damning, Chinese prosecutors even paraded in experts who heightened the drama by displaying heaps of skulls on the courtroom table. On February 6, 1947, the day his verdict was announced, the courtroom was not large enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. More than 2,000 spectators packed the courtroom while a loudspeaker broadcast the proceedings to tens of thousands of residents gathered outside. Judgment Day 173. No one was surprised that the verdict was guilty. On March 10, 1947, the court sentenced Tani Hisao to death after concluding that his forces had violated the Hague Convention concerning the customs of war on land and the wartime treatment of prisoners of war, and helped perpetrate a law. terror that claimed an estimated 300,000 lives in Nanking. Most of the city turned out to watch his execution. On April 26, spectators lined the streets and sidewalks as guards led Tani Hisao, his arms bound behind his back, to the execution grounds at Uhuatai, or Rainflower Terrace, an area just south of Nanking. There he met his death by gunfire, a fate that many survivors believed to be infinitely more humane than what had befallen most of his victims. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMF, also known as the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, began in the capital of Japan on May 3, 1946. The scope of the trial was staggering. The IMF drew more than 200,000 spectators and 419 witnesses. The transcript of the trial spanned 49,000 pages, contained 10 million words, and included 779 affidavits and depositions and 4,336 exhibits. Dubbed the trial of the century, it lasted for 2.5 years, 3 times as long as the Nuremberg trials. Indeed, the IMF would become the longest war crimes trial in history. The IMF commanded enormous media and legal attention, even though only 28 Japanese military and political officials were prosecuted. On any given day, more than 1,000 people packed the courtroom, including judges, lawyers, foreign correspondents, newsreel cameramen, legal staff, MPs, stenographers, and translators. To the left of the press section sat the justices from 11 allied nations, on an elevated platform. To the right, the accused. Spectators sat perched in the balconies, while lawyers, aides, and clerks stood below in the pit. Everyone wore earphones because the proceedings were conducted in both English and Japanese. At the IMF, 1,000 miles emerged, wrote Arnold Brackman in his book The Other Nuremberg, The Untold Story of the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. During the trial, thousands of horrific details of Japanese behavior across Asia came together in reams of news reports, surveys, statistics, and witness testimony. The IMF not only created an enduring oral history record of the Nanking Massacre, but proved that the massacre was just a tiny fraction of the totality of atrocities committed by the Japanese during the war. The prosecution learned, among other things, of Japanese medical experiments on their captives, of marches such as the infamous Baton Death March, in which gravely ill and starved prisoners dropped dead from exhaustion, of the savage conditions behind the construction of the Siam-Burma Death Railway, of the Japan as water treatment that pumped water or kerosene into the noses and mouths of victims until their bowels ruptured, of suspension of POWs by wrists, arms, or legs until their joints were literally ripped from their sockets, of victims being forced to kneel on sharp instruments, of excruciating extractions of nails from fingers, of electric shock torture, of naked women forced to sit on charcoal stoves, of every imaginable form of beating and flogging. A favored method of torture by military police officers involved tying prisoners to trees, surrounding them, and kicking them to death in a method they euphemistically called triple attack, or converging from 3 directions, even of vivisection and cannibalism. It was later determined that Japanese treatment of their POWs surpassed in brutality even that of the Nazis. Only 1 in 25 American POWs died under Nazi captivity, in contrast to 1 in 3 under the Japanese. The Rape of Nanking, perhaps the highlight of the IMF, served as a metaphor for Japanese behavior during the entire span of the war. Brackman, who had covered the IMTFE as a young limited press reporter, pointed out that the Rape of Nanking was not the kind of isolated incident common to all wars. It was deliberate. It was policy. It was known in Tokyo. For that matter, it was front-page news in the world's press. Judgment Day 175. This was what the 1MTFE was all about. The evidence presented at the trial overwhelmed the Japanese defense. Several members of the International Safety Zone Committee flew to Tokyo to read from their diaries, present their own research findings, and answer questions about the Rape of Nanking. The IMF verdict unequivocally denounced the Japanese for their crimes in Nanking, citing one observer's claim that the Japanese soldiers were let loose like a barbarian horde to desecrate the city. The tribunal also concluded that the Japanese government had been well aware of the atrocities in Nanking. i.e. crimes, after all, happened in plain view of the Japanese embassy. The International Committee had made daily visits to representatives at the Japanese Foreign Office and the Japanese Embassy to report on the situation, even filing 2 protests a day for the first 6 weeks. Joseph Grew, the American ambassador in Tokyo, held personal meetings with top Japanese officials, including Hirota Kaki, to inform them of the atrocities. Moreover, Ito Nobufumo, Japan's minister-at-large in China, in 1937 and 1938, had also forwarded reports of Japanese outrages in China to Hirota. The brunt of the blame for the Nanking atrocities fell on Matsui Iwane. As the commander of Japan's Central China Expeditionary Force at the time, Matsui served as the most obvious target. 1 month before the Nanking invasion, Matsui had boasted that his mission was to chastise the Nanking government and the outrageous Chinese. On December 17, 1937, he had entered the city with great pomp and ceremony, perched on top of a chestnut horse as soldiers cheered him on. But historians have suggested that Matsui may have served as the scapegoat for the Rape of Nanking. A sickly and frail man suffering from tuberculosis, Matsui was not even in Nanking when the city fell. Because of the lack of literature on the subject, Matsui's responsibility for the crimes at Nanking remains a subject for further research and debate. The evidence suggests, however, that the tubercular general was guilt-stricken over the entire episode, no doubt because he was unable to maintain order in the Japanese army after Osaka took command. To atone for the sins of Nanking, Matsui erected a shrine of remorse on a hill in his hometown of Atmi, a beach resort some 50 miles down the coast from Tokyo. Sacks of clay, imported from the banks of the Yangtze River, were mixed with native Japanese soil, and then sculpted, baked, and glazed into the statue of Kannon, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. Before this statue, a priestess was hired by the Matsui family to chant prayers and weep for the Chinese war dead. But a public show of self-flagellation is one thing, and the willingness to seek justice for the wrong quite another. To this day, Matsui's behavior at the IMF remains perplexing. During his testimony, he failed to disclose the full story of what happened in Nanking, an account that would have implicated the imperial family. Instead, he waffled between lies and occasional self-denunciation. He tried to make excuses for the atrocities of Nanking, sometimes denied them completely, and irritated the prosecution with his circuitous, vaguely mystical discussions about Buddhism and the nature of Sino-Japanese friendship. But never once did he point accusatory fingers at the imperial throne. Rather, he blamed himself for failing to properly guide Prince Osaka and the emperor, and he told the prosecutors that it was his duty to die for them. "I am happy to end this way," he said. "I am really eager to die at any time." He got his wish. The tribunal concluded that the Rape of Nanking was either secretly ordered or willfully committed, and sentenced Matsui to death. He was not the only one. A total of 7 Japanese Class A war criminals, including Japanese Foreign Minister Hirota Kaki, were judged guilty by the IMF and later hanged at the Sugamo prison in Tokyo. Unfortunately, many of the chief culprits of the Rape of Nanking, or those who might have exercised their royal authority to stop the rape, never spent a day in court. General Nakajima Kesago died shortly after Japan's surrender. The man whose troops had committed some of the worst Nanking outrages passed away on October 28, 1945, apparently of uremia and cirrhosis of the liver. There were rumors that Nakajima was an alcoholic and committed suicide, but his eldest son said that his illness was caused by inhalation of gases, to which he was exposed when employed in chemical weapons research and education. By coincidence, an American MP, who came to question Nakajima about war crimes, arrived at his door, just as a physician was informing the family that Nakajima had died. His biographer Kimura Kananri, who believes Nakajima followed a take-no-prisoners policy in Nanking, quoted Nakajima's son as saying, "Had my father lived, he probably would not have escaped execution." General Yanagawa Haisuke also died in 1945. Before his death by heart attack, however, he gave several interviews to his friend Sugawara Yutaka, who used 7 volumes of notes from their conversations together to publish a book. Though the book is mostly laudatory of Yanagawa's military exploits, he was a rare man and a great talent, Sugawara writes. It does address the subject of the Rape of Nanking. Yanagawa simply poo-pooed the entire episode, assuring Sugawara that reports of his men's atrocities were groundless rumors. Rather, he boasted that his soldiers had followed such strict military discipline in Nanking that even when quartered in Chinese homes, they took care to wear slippers. Hirohito lived long after Japan's surrender, but never faced a full moral accounting for his activities during the war. In exchange for Japan's surrender, the American government granted him, the Emperor of Japan, immunity from trial, so he was not called in as a defendant or even a witness. Because the terms of the surrender exonerated all members of the Japanese imperial family,